At 27,000 feet over northern Germany, air is supposed to be clear. Up here, clouds are below you. Weather is someone else's problem. You're above it. That on December 20th, 1943, over Bremen, the sky was anything but cleared. It was full of black flowers, flak bursts. They hung in the thin air like angry ink blots, each one a sphere of shrapnel big enough to rip a bomber open. Threading through that storm was a single B-17F Flying Fortress, call sign from the 379th Bomb Group, nicknamed in neat white script under the nose. Ye Olde Pub. Nothing about her looked neat now. Her nose cone was gone, shattered plexiglass and bent framing flapping in the slipstream. The metal skin around the cockpit was chewed and scarred. Number 2 engine, port inboard, was dead, prop feathered. Number 4, the starboard outboard, trailed smoke, every revolution sending a shudder through the wing. The tail looked like it had tried to stop a train. The right horizontal stabilizer was half shot away, cloth and metal flapping. The tail gunner's position was ripped open, jagged holes where clear perspex and twin .50s should have been. Inside, 10 men were discovering just how long a few minutes can be in the pilot's seat. Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown, 21 years old, from West Virginia, gripped the control column so hard his fingers ached inside his gloves. Oxygen mask clamped to his face, goggles smeared with frost and blood. He fought the controls with everything he had. His co-pilot beside him was slumped, bleeding from shrapnel wounds. The navigator and bombardier, up in the wrecked nose, were wounded. The radio operator behind them had a bandaged head and was drifting in and out of consciousness. The eye in the tail. There was no more tail gunner. A direct flak hit had torn that position apart and killed him outright. Why Ye Olde Pub should not have been flying. Not with a great, jagged gash down her. Fresh. No smoke. No holes that IT slid in behind them. Perfectly placed for a textbook kill shot. Just low enough to rake the wings and engines. Just high enough to pour fire directly into the cockpit. The tail guns were silent. There were no tail guns anymore. Charlie's heart thudded in his throat. He'd survived flak and the first wave of fighters. He'd wrestled a wounded Fortress back from a death dive. And now a clean, undamaged 109 sat on his tail with a full belt of 20mm cannon shells and 7.92mm machine gun ammo, .1 short burst, and it would all be over. He waited for the bright, staccato flashes and the thump of impacts. They didn't come. Instead, the Bf-109 eased closer, then slid sideways, until German fighter and American bomber flew wingtip to wingtip at 12,000 feet. The enemy pilot turned his head and looked straight into the B-17's cockpit. Charlie looked back. Through cracked glass and frost, 2 young men in different uniforms locked eyes. The German raised his hand. Not to fire. TO signal, flat palm. Pushing motion, turn, land, give up. Charlie didn't understand. Or he pretended not to. He kept his wounded bird pointed west. What happened next shouldn't make any sense. Not in the middle of the air war over Germany. Not with orders, medals, and survival on the line. TO understand why it did. We need to rewind to a smoked-up briefing room in England and to a German fighter pilot who'd already killed more than enough for one lifetime. A few hours earlier, in the pre-dawn chill of an English winter, Grafton Underwood Airfield was waking up. Jeep headlights picked out the shapes of B-17s parked in neat rows. Ground crews rolled bomb carts. Armorers checked fuses. Fuel trucks hissed that in a long, low hut near the operations building. Crewmen shuffled into the briefing room, stamping cold from their boots. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and nerves. Charlie Brown took a seat with his crew, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, flight engineer / top turret gunner, radio operator, ball turret gunner, waist gunners, tail gunner. They were new. A couple of veterans mixed in, but as a team, this was their baptism. The group intelligence officer stepped up, grabbed the curtain cord, and yanked. The green cloth snapped aside, revealing the map. Red string arced from their base in central England, across the North Sea, into the heart of Germany. Target, Bremen. Specifically, the Focke-Wulf aircraft factory and associated facilities. Flak likely. Heavy and accurate. Fighters, Bf-109s and FW-190s for multiple Gruppen. Weather at altitude, clear, good for bombing and for interception. The IO tapped the map, pointing out known flak batteries, predicted fighter rendezvous points. Stay in formation. Don't straggle. Hit the target, then get out. Remember your training, and you'll be fine. They always said that. After the briefing, in the crew room, the facade cracked. Some men checked their gear in silence, hands trembling just enough to betray them. Others wisecracked too loudly about lousy coffee and English weather. Charlie ran his own checklist, target info memorized. Formation position, about middle of the group. Call sign, radio frequencies. Contingencies if they lost engines that he tried not to think about the statistics. Bomber Command and the 8th Air Force bled aircraft daily over Europe. Crews counted completed me. Signs like lifelines, 10, 15, 25. This was mission 1. They walked out to the hard stand against a backdrop of cloud-streaked sky, just turning from black to indigo. Up close. Ye Olde Pub looked big, purposeful, almost comforting. 4 big Wright R182 row cyclones, each with 1,200 horsepower, sat waiting under broad, dihedral wings. Her tail rose nearly as high as a house. Her name stenciled under the cockpit was half joke, half good luck charm, some acknowledgement that this cold, deadly work might one day be something older men told stories about over drinks. Her serial number, 423167, was stenciled neatly on the tail. Charlie ran his hand along her flank on the way up the ladder, feeling cold aluminum under his glove down on the flight deck. He strapped in, ran the pre-flight with his co-pilot. Mixture rich, props full fine, cowl flaps. Set. Fuel selectors cross-feed normal. They called the tower, got clearance, and roll point 4 engines roared. The bomber rumbled down the runway, tail lifting. Then the whole big assembly surged into the sky. They climbed through cloud into a pale, bright world above. Around them, other fortresses joined up, weaving into their combat box. Layers of overlapping guns and mutual protection. The German flag gunner looking up. It would soon resemble a moving city of aluminum. Charlie. In that moment, above the cold, gray water of the North Sea, it must have felt, however briefly, like they were invincible .10 men for engines, 13.50 caliber machine guns, and 1,000 little things waiting to go wrong between England and Bremen. Hours later, over Germany, the flight plan met reality. From the nose, the bombardier called out waypoints as they droned over patchwork fields and small towns. The navigator hunched over his charts, cross-checking dead reckoning with glimpses of rivers and railways in the gaps between clouds. At around 27,000 feet, the air temperature outside hovered around -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the unheated fuselage, the men's breath frosted their oxygen masks. Exposed metal stuck briefly to any bare skin. Weapons crews wore electric-heated suits under heavy flying gear, fingers numbed inside gloves. Ahead, Bremen grew closer. German radar saw them coming. Controllers fed data to gun batteries and fighter units, the IP. The initial point before the bomb run, the formation tightened. Bomb bay doors cracked open. The lead bombardier took over, guiding the formation on its run. Then the flak started. Flak isn't random. The Germans aimed their 88s, 105s, and 128s to put time-fused shells into boxes of sky where they expected the bombers to be in a few seconds. The first bursts were low and off to the side. Then they walked in. Black puffs with orange flashes in their centers appeared at the pub's altitude and range, filling the space between and around the fortresses. Ye Olde Pub flew into it. A shell detonated just beneath her nose, sending steel fragments tearing upward. The plexiglass nose cone exploded inward. The bombardier was thrown back, his face and hands lacerated. The navigator caught splinters and bits of glass. Shards scythed through wiring and instruments. Another burst went off near the right side of the cockpit. One fragment punched through the side window, cutting into Charlie's right shoulder and grazing his head. Another sliced across the co-pilot's leg. Lights flickered. The aircraft shuddered. From the cockpit, through the hole where the nose had been, Arlie could look straight down at Bremen. Smoke already rose from bomb hits. The Focke-Wulf facility, hangars, and rail yards were framed in a surreal panorama. He pushed those thoughts away long enough to do his job. Bomb bay doors open. Icy wind howled up through the belly. The bombardier, half blinded by blood and broken glass, forced himself to his sight, lined up as best he could, and toggled. Bombs dropped away, the sudden weight change making the pub lurch upward slightly. Bombs away. The formation turned off target. That's when the fighters came. They didn't arrive as a chaotic swarm. They came like professionals. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s climbed to meet the bombers, then rolled in from altitude, diving through the formation from 12 o'clock high, 1 o'clock, and 2 o'clock, cannon and machine guns blazing. Others attacked from the beam, and from 6 o'clock LOW.in the pub, gunners snapped into the routines drilled into them for months. Fighters 1 o'clock high fighter, 9 o'clock level. Range 500, top turret traverse, twin point 50s. Chattering. Waist gunners fired in short. Aim burst to avoid overheating. The ball turret, hanging beneath the belly, swung to meet low attackers. The gunner encased in his tiny sphere of steel, the world upside down as fighters flashed past. They scored some hits. A 190 tore through the formation. Tracers from the pub and her neighbors walking across his wings and fuselage. He broke hard, trailing smoke, disappearing into cloud below. But the Germans were good, and they had numbers that a head-on pass from a 109 raked the cockpit with 20mm shells. One slammed into the right side of the windshield frame, showering glass and metal. Another burst near the number 2 engine nacelle. Engine number 2 sputtered, oil streaming back, then seized. Charlie feathered the prop, watched with grim satisfaction as it straightened into the wind. 3 engines left. In the rear. The tail gunner called out attackers until a burst from a 190's cannons detonated almost inside his position. The tail plexiglass vanished in a puff. Shrapnel and force did the rest. The intercom went quiet from the tail. Tail, report. Tail, this is pilot, report. Nothing. I didn't know for sure yet, but he was dead. More passes chewed at them. The formation slipped around them, each pilot jinking in small, prescribed moves, trying to throw off the fighter's aim while not breaking cohesion. The Ye Olde Pub was losing the battle to stay in a box. Her damaged engines couldn't hold speed. Her controls were sluggish as severed and frayed cables stretched and snapped. Gradually, then more quickly, she fell behind TO-8 German fighter pilot. A straggling fortress was the juiciest target in the sky. Out of formation, she had fewer mutual guns covering her. Alone, she could be attacked from blind spots and angles that would be suicidal against a full box. They pounced. Accounts vary on exactly how many fighters hit Ye Olde Pub in the next several minutes. Brown later estimated at least 15 individual attacks. They came in from 12 o'clock high, 11 o'clock low, 7 o'clock from a vertical roll over the tail. Everything in the Luftwaffe's playbook. The pub's guns barked back until some literally ran out of ammunition or were shot off their mounts. Cannon rounds slammed into the wings, shot away chunks of ailerons and flaps. Hold fuel tanks, ignited a brief, terrifying wing fire that miraculously went out on its own as wind tore at. A .120mm round punched through the fuselage and exploded in the radio room, wounding the operator and shredding equipment. Another burst tore through the cockpit floor, smashing the rudder pedals, showering the pilot's legs with fragments. Finally, a sustained attack from behind and below ripped into the tail and rear fuselage with such violence that the bomber stalled and dropped. She went nose down into a dive that Charlie's world turned into a vibrating blur of instruments and howling wind. The altimeter unwound. 25,000, 20,000. 15,000. The controls felt dead. There was so much damage to the tail surfaces and cables that at first, moving the yoke did nothing. Then, slowly, grudgingly, the nose started to come up at a T around 12,000 feet. The denser air bit the remaining control surfaces. The strong, built-in dihedral of the wings helped self-right the ship. She eased out of the dive, engines screaming, frame groaning. Somewhere in that dive, Charlie passed out from lack of oxygen and shock, then snapped back when the lower, thicker air hit his lungs. He looked over. His co-pilot was groggy but alive. Blood trickled down from a scalp wound. He looked back. Through the jagged hole where the tail should have neatly met the fuselage, he saw open Ye Olde Pub was still flying alone. Low, slow, easy to find, he pointed her west. He thought the worst was over. Then the last fighter showed up. While Ye Olde Pub clawed for home, a different cockpit framed the same cold sky. Franz Stigler sat strapped into his BF-09 G6, gloved hands resting lightly on stick and throttle. He was no rookie. By late 1943, Stigler had flown over North Africa and in the defense of the Reich, his tally of victories climbing. He knew the flicker of sunlight on aluminum that meant a distant bomber. He knew the smell of burned oil, the feel of G-forces in a vertical bank, the sound of cannon recoil, that he also knew what was at stake. German cities were being burned nightly. The Focke-Wulf plant he was defending built fighters that were supposed to keep men like Charlie Brown from reaching their targets. His job was simple: shoot down bombers. That day, he had already attacked the tail end of the American stream. Some sources say he had just downed a fortress and been refueled and rearmed. Others that he was still in the air from the initial interception. Either way, when controllers gave him a vector to a single, slow-moving bomber trailing the main group, it sounded like almost a formality, an easy third kill that might finally earn him the Knight's Cross. He rolled his 109 into a climb, engine humming. Gauges alive with numbers he'd learned to read at a glance, that a speck appeared ahead. Low and solitary T. Adjusted throttle and prop pitch. Closed in. From a few hundred yards back, Ye Olde Pub looked like any other damaged fortress. As Stigler approached, he realized she wasn't just damaged, she was wrecked. Her tail was shredded, the port side stabilizer barely attached. The rear fuselage gaped open in places. He could see daylight through holes that should not exist. The dorsal turret was silent, guns pointed uselessly off to the side. Waistgunner windows were blown out, plastic and frames gone. He nudged the stick, sliding just beneath the bomber's six to get a look at her belly. He saw bomb bay doors twisted and partly jammed. Large holes in the fuselage skinned in return fire from ventral positions. He moved up along the starboard side, just below the wing in the side of the fuselage, where metal had been peeled away by explosions. He saw men. Some crouched over someone lying down. Bandages, blood point one man. A waist gunner had his .50 still pointed outward, but the barrel drooped, and his face was gray with exhaustion and pain. Stigler slid further forward until his canopy was roughly a beam of the B-17's cockpit. He looked in. Through a cracked and blood-spattered canopy, he saw two faces look back. American faces under leather helmets and oxygen masks, eyes ringed with frost and fatigue. .1. Charlie Brown still had his hands on the yoke, knuckles white, jaw clenched. Stigler later said he'd never forgotten what he saw in those faces. Fear, determination. In youth, he also remembered something else. Back in training, long before he'd scored his first victory, his commanding officer, a veteran named Gustav Rodel, had given his pilots a lecture. You follow the rules of war, not of madness. If I ever hear of any of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I'll shoot you myself. This wasn't a parachute. The bomber technically could still fly, but as Stigler looked at the torn, limping fortress and the wounded men inside, he realized what finishing them would be. It wouldn't be a fight. It would be an execution. He had his thumb on the trigger. One squeeze and cannon shells would explode through the remaining engines, fuel tanks, or cockpit. The fortress would tumble down into a field or break apart over the North Sea. Maybe the survivors would get out. Maybe they wouldn't. No one on the ground would have questioned his claim. Another bomber down. Industrial plan avenged. One step closer to a medal. But Stigler also knew that from the ground this looked odd. If German flak crews down there saw 109 form up close on a bomber and then not shoot, someone might have awkward questions. He had seconds to decide. In Charlie's cockpit, the sight was surreal. A sleek enemy fighter easing up to fly formation, close enough to touch. The navigator shouted, "He's going to finish us." Gunners who could still move tried to bring weapons to bear, but some guns were jammed or destroyed. Others simply didn't have a depression to aim. Charlie kept a death grip on the yoke, expecting impact any second. Instead, the German pilot raised his hand, palm down, then pushed it sideways and downland. "Give up." Charlie didn't respond. Partly, he didn't understand. Training and adrenaline said, "Point west, get home." Partly, he was stubborn. He was not landing this wreck on a German field if he could help it. Stigler, reading the refusal, made his choice. He eased his 109 out ahead, then tucked back in on the B-17's port side, slightly below and behind where ground AA observers would see his silhouette and the bombers together. Together, they flew west. Over German territory. Over angry flak crews who held their fire rather than risk hitting their own fighter. For several long minutes, this absurd pair moved like wingmen. Battered fortress and pristine Messerschmitt could see the edge of the North Sea, with gray water opening up beneath them. Stigler knew he had to turn back. Fuel, orders, and the simple physics of airframes put a limit on how far he could escort an enemy. He slid back up level, looked across one more time, eyeing the B-17's cockpit. Charlie looked back, eyes wide. The German raised his hand, this time in a clear, simple salute. Charlie, half in shock, half in gratitude, managed a brief, shaky wave. Stigler rolled his 109, banked away to the north, and was gone. And gun cameras rolling. No witnesses except for the 10 men in the bomber and 1 man in the fighter. Ye Olde Pub flew on, over endless gray water, held together by luck, design, and stubbornness. For Charlie Brown and his crew, the hours that followed were some of the longest of their lives. 12,000 feet, above the reach of small arms fire but below most radar coverage, Ye Olde Pub droned over the North Sea on 2.5 good engines. Every creak and vibration threatened to become the one that finally tore the wounded tail free or shook a wing off. The navigator did his best to keep track on a chart that refused to stay still, drawing a thin pencil line westward. Eventually, a darker smudge appeared on the horizon. Coast. England. They crossed over friendly fields and hedgerows, descending toward an emergency strip. Charlie lowered flaps a notch, then another, testing the battered hydraulics. One side responded more than the other. He compensated with power, fighting asymmetry all the way in. The landing wasn't pretty. Point 1 will hit first. The damaged tail sagged. For a moment, it felt like the whole structure might fold, but the fortress stayed upright, rolled, and finally shuddered to a halt. Engines cut. Props wound down. For a few seconds, no one moved. The sudden silence was almost as shocking as the battle had been. Then the smell of fuel and scorched metal hit, and training kicked in. They got out. Ground crews and medics, who had watched the approach with mounting disbelief, ran out to meet them. Photos taken that day show a B-17 that looks like she'd flown through a buzzsaw. Nose destroyed, skin peeled back along the right side. Tailplane half gone. Hundreds of bullet and shrapnel holes. Point 1 engine burned. Another dead. The debriefing officers did what they always did. They took notes. Asked about flak concentrations. Fighter tactics. Damaged at some point. Charlie told them about the 109 that had come up alongside and not fired. He described the hand signals. The escort to the coast. The final salute. The intelligence officer listened, then sigh. Do something along the lines of, "You're sure about that?" "Yes, sir." "And the Messerschmitt didn't shoot at you?" "No." Sir, a pause. A long look that don't tell anyone else about that outside this room. They'll think you're crazy, and it won't do anyone any good. We'll note it. That's all. Officially, the mission report focused on damage, flak, and fighters. The mercy moment went into a file that very few people would ever see. Unofficially, among the crew of Ye Olde Pub, the story lived. They told it quietly, in crew rooms and bars, to those they trusted. The German fighter who spared them. Most of the time, people raised eyebrows, smiled, and chalked it up to combat stress and foggy memory. The war moved on. Bremen was bombed again. Other crews went missing. Franz Stigler went back to his own war. In his debriefs, he said nothing about the incident. He logged his sorties, his real kills, his fuel and ammo use he had seen. By then, enough bombers fall in flames, he didn't need one more on his conscience. Germany lost the war. Stigler survived. No small feat for a Luftwaffe fighter pilot in the last years of the Reich. He emigrated, rebuilt his life and business, carried his memories in silence. Charlie Brown stayed with the Air Force for a time, then went home, started a family, worked, lived. For decades, both men had an unanswered question lodged in their minds. For Charlie, who was that German pilot? And why did he let us go? For Franz, did they make it? In the late 1980s and early 1990s, the world Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler had fought over had changed. The Cold War was thawing. Former enemies talked. Veterans associations flourished. Historians started digging into dusty files. Charlie, now older, retired, and with more time to chase ghosts, found himself thinking again about the Bremen mission that he knew now from books and documentaries, how rare his experience had been. He also knew that if he didn't try to find the man in the 109, it would never happen. That he started with a simple step that he wrote. Letters went out to veteran newsletters, reunion groups, and magazines, describing the encounter as he remembered it. Date, 20 December 1943. Place, near Bremen. Aircraft, B-17F of the 379th, heavily damaged event. German fighter flew alongside, did not fire, escorted them to coast. The letters described the damage, the missing tail gunner, the salute. For months, there was nothing. Then, in a small German veterans newsletter, a man named Franz Stigler read the story. He felt old feelings slam back into place. The fortress, the gaping tail, the wounded faces in the cockpit, the refusal to fire. He wrote back. Carefully, modestly, he laid out his side of the story, where he'd been based. What unit? What he'd seen when he approached. What he'd done. Details matched. Dates. Damage. Behavior. Brown's B-17 had been so uniquely wrecked that the odds of a second, identical incident were essentially zero. They set up a meeting. When they finally met in person, two old men decades removed from the war, now in civilian clothes instead of uniforms. It wasn't at 12,000 feet over an enemy country. IT was in a house, or at an airfield, depending on which account you see first. Photos from that day show Charlie, white-haired, a little stooped, but with the same sharp eyes. Franz, older too, bearing the look many Luftwaffe veterans see. Ride, pride and skill, grief for the cause it had been spent on. They shook hands. Then, as the ice broke, they embraced. They talked for hours. Charlie learned why Franz hadn't shot. Franz learned how close the fortress had come to falling apart on the way home, and how his escort had probably spared them not just fighters, but confused flak batteries along the coast. They compared notes on the dive, the damage, the exact path they took to the sea. They started calling each other, writing, visiting. Over time, they became something like brothers. In interviews, Charlie would later say, "To me, Franz Stigler was the epitome of a professional fighter pilot. But more than that, he was a man of honor." Franz, for his part, said, "I could not have shot at them. It would have been like shooting at a man in a parachute." Their story became more widely known after author Adam Makos told it in the book A Higher Call, an apt title for what had happened up there. Two men on opposite sides of a total war, each trained and paid to kill the other, answered to something older and deeper than orders. When they both died in 2008, their obituaries often mentioned the other, Brown, the bomber pilot who survived because an enemy refused to finish him off; Stigler, the fighter ace who walked away from a guaranteed kill and a likely medal because he believed there were lines even war should not cross. For your viewers, the ones who know the ammo count of a B-17S guns, the fuel curves of a Wright Cyclone, the climb rate of a BF-109G, there's a lot to admire in the hardware here. But the part that sticks after the statistics and the paint schemes is this: a fortress that should have died, but didn't, at a fighter that could have killed, but didn't. Doctrine said, finish the wounded enemy, score the kill, protect the factory. Win the medal. Franz Stigler chose not to. Charlie Brown, decades later, chose not to let that choice go unthanked. They both, in their own time, swam against the current of what was expected. In most war stories, we remember the shots fired. This one is famous because of the shot not fired. In an era where we talk a lot about rules of engagement and collateral damage in the abstract, this is what it looks like in the cockpit. You see the whites of someone's eyes. You know you've got them cold. And you choose mercy. That's not weakness. That's a different kind of courage. If you stick around this channel, You'll see plenty of stories where people took the harder, deadlier path. Destroyers charging battleships, tin cans fighting fleets, pilots making ramming attacks when their guns failed. Those mattered as do the stories where someone eases their finger off the trigger, salutes, and lets another man go home. If you had a father or grandfather in the 8th Air Force, or in the Luftwaffe, or in any air arm where men hung between life and death on a stranger's choice, there. Stories walk alongside this one. Tell them in the comments. And if you want more, combatboxtactics.engineout returns. Micro moments over flak and farmland where decisions outweigh doctrine. Hit subscribe, drop a like, and share this with someone who still listens when old pilots talk. Because as long as we keep telling it, the story of a shredded bomber named Ye Olde Pub, a mess. Schmidt with a yellow nose, and the day humanity overruled war. They're more than a couple of names in a book. They're still up there, just over Bremen. One limping west on 2 engines, one sliding alongside on full power, until a hand goes up in a silent salute, and both turn for home.